City Life family. It's really good to be here again. And again, we're in the book of Revelations. I know this is part 14, and we've been at it almost a year and a half. However, we are in chapter 4. And last time I got, I think, into at least 4 verses. But I find this now exciting. We're going to try to finish chapter 4 today, because now we are in a place which we call heaven. As you know, chapter 2 and 3 are the 7 churches, and it's all about the church age. And chapter 1 was about the what's happened in the past as well. So now we are in heaven. The church is not existing at all. And so we're up to this point, and I'm going to read you Revelation chapter 4, verses 4. And it says this: "And around about the throne were 24 seats. And upon these seats I saw 24 elders sitting," it says, "clothed in white raiment, and they had their heads crowns of gold." Now, there is a lot of speculations amongst these theologians about these 24 elders. And some say they are angelic beings, but I'll be honest with you, that's not true. And I'm going to prove that to you. And there's 3 reasons why I believe that it's not true. First of all, number 1, because angelic beings are never called elders in the Bible. The word elders is a Greek word called presbyterios. And in fact, the denomination Presbyterians actually comes from the Greek word. And the reason they call themselves Presbyterians is because they are ruled by a board of elders ruled by presbyterios. And but I want you to realize that angelic beings are never referred to as angels. Secondly, angels don't wear crowns. They don't sit on the thrones, and these are thrones, not seats. They don't let the word seats in the King James fool you. So it's actually not a very good translation. The word means thronos, and it actually means thrones. And of course, we get our word thrones from that Greek word. And the third reason is this: I don't believe that 24 elders are angelic beings is because white robes in the book of Revelations are always referred to for the saints. So I know that they're not angelic beings. Others say that the 24 elders represent 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles. You've got the 12 tribes and you've got the 12 apostles, and when you add those 2 up, it comes to 24. But 24 elders are supposed to represent all of God's people, both Old Testament and New Testament. But I'll be honest with you, this is a good theory and has some merit to it, because in Revelation 21 we find the names of the 12 tribes inscribed in the gates of heaven, and the names of the 12 apostles that are inscribed upon the 12 foundation stones. But if you would like me just in Revelation 21, I'm going to read verses 12 to 14, and I'm going to try to explain where I believe that this is really coming from. Revelation 21:12 says this: and had a wall great and high, the 12 gates, at the gates 12 angels named, written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. 21:13 says, on the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, and on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. Verses 14 says, and that the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So there's some merit in this theory, but I still believe there's much more than that. So who are these 12 elders? Because if you don't know who the 12 elders are, we're going through the book of Revelation, we're not going to understand what's going on, because the 12th and the 24 elders play a vital role in the story of the book of Revelations. So who are these 24 elders? Well, let's look at the description and see if we can figure it out. Now, I've always said this, that Scripture always interprets Scripture. That's a part of what we call is the theology of hermeneutics. First of all, the 24 of them, and that's very important detail, because whenever you see the detail in the Bible, you need to pay close attention to it. So the Bible is very detailed. Every I is dotted, every T is crossed, and there's always a reason for it. And the number 24 is very important because it's the only used 6 times in the Old Testament, and every case is associated with one thing only. You want to know what that is? I'll tell you what it is. It's priesthood. So you see, the Old Testament, there are thousands of priests from the tribes of Levi. I think most of you, of us, don't realize that. But if you remember, when Israel came into the Promised Land, and they were dividing up the land, and the Levites did not get any inheritance of the land. Why? Because they were not supposed to make their living from farming or raising cattle or from doing any of those things. They were priests. And in fact, their inheritance was actually the cities. And so all the tribes of the Levites were supposed to do what? They were supposed to minister in the temple or minister in some capacity for God. But now there were so many priests that they couldn't come all together at the same time and work at the temple at one time. So something had to be done, because when there's thousands of priests coming together at the same time, there are too many. So David actually appointed 12 elders to represent the entire Levitical priesthood. What he did was he divided the priests into 24 different groups. Now this is very interesting. Each group served for 2 weeks at a time in the temple. So let me just recalculate that. So if you got 24, and then you got 2 weeks, each one serving 2 weeks, you can see 2 weeks is 1 month. So you got 2 lots of 24, 2 lots of 12, then, which makes up 24. So you'll find that 24 groups listed. And 1 Chronicles chapter 24, verses 17 to 18, in fact, John the Baptist's father was Zechariah. And do you remember that he was a Levite and he was a part of the 8th group? So out of the 24 groups, he was a part of the 8th group. And if you're ever reading the story about John the Baptist, you will come upon this in Luke chapter 1, verses number 5. Listen to what it says. In the time of Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah. And this is John the Baptist's father, who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife, Elizabeth, was also descendant of Aaron. Now, the priestly division of Abijah was the 8th group. So there were groups. So remember, only 24 groups could go into the temple in the time of the year at that time. So look at 1 Chronicles chapter 24, verses 10. 1 Chronicles 24, verse 10 says this: the 7th Hakkoz, the 8th group, to Abijah. So he's dividing out 24 groups, and we're only going to read a part of it. So the 7th to Hakkoz, the 8th to Abijah. In other words, Abijah was over this 8th group. So 2 weeks out of the year, your group went to the temple and you ministered in the temple. Now, if you remember the story of John the Baptist, his father was ministering inside the temple when the archangel came and told him that he was going to have a son. Well, we all know that story. Elizabeth was quite old and she had gone through menopause. But there was no way that she was going to have a child, so he didn't believe. So what happened to him? The angel said, because you don't believe, you're going to be dumb. So in other words, he couldn't talk. In other words, you're not going to be able to speak. And so Zechariah comes out of the temple and he can't speak, and they realize that he's seen a vision, but he's not able to speak until John the Baptist is born, and then it comes to the 8th day, and they're supposed to name him. And of course, what do they do? They want to name the son after his father. And Elizabeth says, no, I don't want you to name him after the father. We're going to name him John the Baptist. And they say, oh, you can't do that. You need to name him after the father. And Zechariah is going, he can't speak, and he signals to them, and he starts running, and he says, and this is what happens straight after all this time. He couldn't speak, and then he just says, John, as soon as that comes out, he's able to speak again. So he gets that revelation back. Because they have a child, he realized that God was right. And what we need to understand is that the reason Zechariah was at the temple in the first place is because he was the priest, and those were his 2 weeks out of the year of being there. So now we understand that out of the 24 elders, 2 weeks was allocated to each of those elders, and they would meet at the temple at the precinct of Jerusalem, and they were represented all of the priests. Now that's very interesting. Now why am I telling you all this to do with the 24 elders? You'll get this in a moment. So if we're going to have a meeting of all the priests, you didn't bring thousands of priests together. You had representatives of those priests. The word representative is important here. They didn't have the sound system. They didn't do things that way. So what they would do is they would take a leader from each group who was referred to as an elder. And when all of the elders came to Jerusalem and met in the temple precinct, they represented the priests. Now, that's very important. So you need to remember that 24 elders represented the priesthood according to Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 says this. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 says this. It says, but you are chosen generation. Listen to what he says. He said, a royal priesthood. He's talking about us. A holy nation. A peculiar people. That you should show forth the praises of him whom has called you out of darkness into marvelous light. Now I want you to notice what Peter says. He says that you are a royal priesthood. In other words, he's talking about true, faithful believers. That's why the 24 elders are sitting on the thrones. The only one who sits on the thrones are kings. And so the 24 elders are representing a royal priesthood. Not only that they are wearing white robes, but white robes are reserved for the saints in the book of Revelations. How many of you remember the promise of Revelation chapter 3, verses number 5, when we read that out? To a person who overcomes, looks at Revelations, he says, he that overcomes, the same shall be clothed in white raiment, and I will not blot out his name out of the book life, but I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. But I want you to notice, he's going to be given a white raiment. That's the very same Greek phrase that is used here in Revelation chapter 4, verses 4. And he says this. Also, the 24 elders are wearing crowns. Now, there are two types of crowns. Now, listen to me. This is what it is. The 24 elders are representing the saints. They are representing those that are you and me. In other words, and they also wore two types of crowns. There are two types of crowns. You see, rulers who inherited their crown would be called a diadem, a head wearing, and Solomon would have it. In other words, it was a diadem was a crown that you would inherit from generation to generation, just like King Charles would inherit his crown, Queen Elizabeth would inherit her crown. But there is also another crown which is mentioned here, and it is called the victor's crown. And the victor's crown was a type of crown that you received as a reward or a prize. So what he's saying here is that we're getting ready to have this, what we call is the victor's crown. As they did in those days, they would receive a crown for the Olympics. Now they receive a golden medal or silver or bronze. But back in the ancient days, if you had some type of athletic event, you won the athletic event, you will receive what we call is a victor's crown. It's a reward or a prize. Now, what's interesting is this. The type of crown that the saints receive for serving Jesus. It's our reward or our prize for being faithful. In fact, I've always said this, right? You come to Christ by grace, but you get your rewards or your crown, you get it because of your works. In fact, if you go through the New Testament, you'll find out that there are 5 different crowns that a person can receive, but all of those crowns are not a diadem, something you inherit automatically. They are called victor's crowns. And the reason they're called victor's crowns is because you have run the race faithfully. You have gotten to the point where you deserve a reward or a prize. Now, guess which crown the 24 elders were wearing? Is it a diadem or is it a victor's crown? Well, it's a victor's crown. The type of crown that the saints are going to wear for having served Jesus faithfully. When do the saints get their crowns? Well, they're going to get their crowns Are they going to get it in the 1,000 years of millennium? No, they're not. They're going to get it far before that. When Jesus was teaching his disciples, he was teaching in the parables, and he talked about rewards, and he said this: he that is faithful in much is going to be what is given much. So if you're faithful in much, you're going to be given much. So we're going to actually get to rule with Jesus, but what we rule over depends on how faithful we serve Jesus here on this earth. So that's very, very important. Now, if you didn't really serve Jesus very much, you weren't faithful in your service to him, you're not going to be ruling over very much. So depending on how you served is depending on how you're going to be ruling. So when you rule with Jesus, it's going to be it's not going to be during the 1,000-year period. It's going to be at the time of the rapture, just from the rapture, because at the time of the rapture is the time that you come down. You're going to be ruling in the 1,000 years, but it's the time when you're going to receive your crowns. And when we receive our rewards, when we do receive our crowns, at that rapture, it says in Revelation chapter 22, verses 12, Jesus said, "Behold, I am coming soon. Now notice this, my reward is with me." You see, when we are raptured, we're all going to have to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. But this is not the great white throne. Remember, Christians are going to be judged. We are going to be judged. We're going to be judged for our motivation. You know, we may be doing everything that's good, but our motivation may not be good. So we're going to be judged anyway in terms of what we're going to do. But we're going to be standing before Jesus in order to be punished. That there is no condemnation to those that are in Christ. So we're not going to be condemned. We're just going to be judged. And then we're going to get our rewards. And some of us may not even get any rewards. So we need to understand, but we are rewarded based on what we do. People, we are saved by grace, but we're rewarded by our work. Now, not just works. The works also have to have a right motivation, but if we don't have the right motivation, and even though we give our body to be burned, it's not going to profit us anything, right? Jesus tells us that. Paul tells us that in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, he says this: we need to understand that even though we're saved by grace, we're rewarded by works. How faithfully we served him. And so that when we are raptured, Jesus brings his reward with them. Now, we're going to have everything we're ever done. And of course, this is the kind of metaphor and analogy that he's using. It's going to pass through the fire and it burns up. In other words, you know, there's lots of things that we do that we haven't got the right motivation for. And those things are like wood, hay, and stubble. And if it comes out, it's pure. We're going to receive a reward. And that's what Jesus is talking about, right? Okay? There's a lot of things, right? It's only those that are left behind that's going to be totally solid. But the hay, the wood, and the stubble is just going to burn out. So right after the rapture, right after the end of the church age, that's right at the end of the church age, when the church is raptured, we see a representation of that. When John was raptured, guess what? We're going to stand before Jesus and his rewards with him, and we're going to receive our crowns. So who are the 24 elders? Well, they represent all the saints who've been raptured, all right? They represent the royal priesthood, and who are the royal priesthood? Well, we are right now the 24 elders who represent the royal priesthood, and could very well be the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles, right? It could very well be. But I don't know that. The bottom line is this: they represent the royal priesthood, and when they come together, just like the 24 priests came together, and the 24 elders, they represented all the priests. So we are represented by those elders. The 24 elders sitting on the throne, all the way around the throne of God, and they represent who the raptured saints are, the church, which tells us what church is in heaven right now. Now, if you remember, I told you that the rapture of John represented the rapture of the church, and I gave 3 reasons. And I told you that John's rapture was exactly like what would happen to the saints when they get raptured, right? Do you remember that? Some of you say, maybe I don't remember. Well, anyway, I told you that the second thing, the church is not mentioned again in the book from chapter 4 onwards, okay, until we come to chapter 22. Now, the first 3 chapters has been focused on the revelation and focused on the church. But in the first chapter, we see the 7 golden candlesticks. We see him walking in the midst of that. The 7 golden candlesticks represents the churches, and Jesus is just going in the midst of that. And we see all these things taking place in the focus, even though it's Jesus is ministering to the church. And then the chapter 2 and 3, we see the church age. And like I said before, there are only 2 churches that are given accommodation, given the rubber stamp. The rest of the churches, they need to be worked on, So after chapter 4, verses number 1, we don't hear about the church at all again. Why? Because the church is no longer on this earth. Where is the church? The church is, as we read in chapter 4, is in heaven. They have been raptured, but the third reason that we know that John's rapture represents the rapture of the church is because we see the church in heaven, but it's no longer called the church. Now, we see they're represented by the 12 elders, just like the 12 elders of the priesthood represented all of the priesthood in the Old Testament, but the 24 elders represented all of the other priesthood in the New Testament. They represented the church, and I think that's pretty good. Now, let me give you one more scriptures to show you that the 24 elders represented us, the raptured church or the raptured saints. Turn with me to Revelations chapter 5, verses 8 to 9. And this is what it says. And when he had taken the book, the 4 beasts and the 20 elders fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them harps and golden vials full of odors, which are the praise of the saints. In chapter 5, verses 9, it says this, and they sung a new song, saying, Thou art worthy to take and the book, and to open the seals thereof. For thou wast slain, and hast redeemed us to God by the blood out of every kindred and tongue and the people and the nation. So, all of a sudden, they are including themselves as not only part of the redeemed, but a part of the world that's being redeemed for God. Why? Because they represented all the believers, all the church. So in Revelation chapter 4, we see the church in heaven represented by the 12 elders. I think that's pretty exciting. And so as I said last time, John's rapture in verses number 1 represents the rapture of the church. And now we see the church in heaven. And now the focus is going to go off the church, and the focus is now going on to the people who have been left behind. Unfortunately, this is the part of what we call is the tribulation. There are people going to be left behind. I pray that you won't be one of those. Now, we're in the inner loop period, because when John is raptured up, we're seeing a vision of heaven. And hopefully we're going to finish, the chapter 4 eventually. But when we get to the 6th chapter, we begin to see some things open. In other words, we see God's wrath starting to happen, seals opening, and those kind of things. That is the beginning of what we call is the tribulation. And we'll see the church in heaven, but the focus now is upon the people who are left on this earth, and we need to understand that in verses number 5 of Revelation chapter 4, let me just read that out to you. It says, out of the throne proceeding lightning and thundering and voices, and there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Out of the throne proceeded lightning and thundering and voices. So we know the voices in the Greek means phono, like a phone. Phone is the word, the Greek word phone. And of course, it can mean voice, but normally it doesn't, but it means sound, it means rumbling, because it is placed between lightning and thundering in the original Greek. So I'll just say this very quickly, that there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the seven spirits of God. Now, people, this is the remnants of what is happening as we've seen before, even during the time of Moses on Mount Sinai. How many of you remember Mount Sinai? God came down upon Mount Sinai to meet with Moses, and there was a lightning, thundering, and rumbling. The personification, as we call this, the personification, when God comes down, he doesn't show himself as an image or anything. He comes down in a personification of thundering, lightning, and rumbling. And he wanted Israelites to see that he was communicating with Moses, and that all the people is going to see it and they're going to hear it. Look with me at, if you don't mind, Exodus chapter 19, verses 11, and then go through the 16. It says, "Be sure they are ready on the third day, for the day of the Lord will come down on the Mount Sinai, as all the people watch. And on the morning of the third day, thundering roared and lightning flashed, and dense clouds came down upon the mountain, and there was a loud blast from the ram horns, and all the people trembled." Now, I didn't read all the other scriptures, but you can see that the personification of how God showed his, can I just say, his wrath in one sense. They were rumbling. Now, God told Moses, "I want you to set up a boundary around the mountain, and anyone who crosses the boundary and touches the mountain will die." This is how God deals with things. He always deals with things in a big way. In Exodus, we read in Exodus chapter 19, verse 12, it says, "Mark off the boundaries all around the mountain, warn the people. Please be careful. Do not go up the mountain or even touch its boundaries. Anyone who touches the mountains will certainly be put to death." And you see God was he was revealing his omniscience in this lightning, thunder, and rumbling. It's a personification of his omniscience, all power. And he's not only control what happens in the earth, but he controls the things in the sky as well. He can affect everything in the heavens, and he can affect everything on the earth. And he wanted physical manifestation to reveal his omniscience. But not only that, he used thunder, lightning, and warnings of divine judgment upon all those who disobeyed him. Now, anyone who crossed the boundaries and touched the mountain would die, and that's what John sees in heaven. He sees lightning, he sees thunder, and rumbling proceeding from the throne of God. Now, we're not looking at Jesus in a small cradle, chubby feet, chubby arms, a belly, a pot belly, and all that kind of stuff. We're not seeing that. We are now seeing Jesus as a man who is full of wrath as well. Lightning, thunder, rumbling proceeding from the throne of God, indicating that God's divine judgment is getting ready to be poured out upon those who are left upon this earth. You see, it's a lie just to say Jesus is meek and mild and he's going to be so good to you and he loves you. I mean, that's true. Jesus does love us and loves us to the point that we come to under obedience. And it's going to be, and he's getting ready to see, we're getting ready to see his wrath. As we go more into Revelations, we'll see that. And he's going to be, and it's not going to be nice. It's going to be horrible. It says that lightning, thunder, and rumbling makes it very clear that the dreadful storm is about to burst upon the world. And that's what John is saying. This is what he sees. We need to understand that when he is raptured and taken to heaven, John is raptured and taken to heaven, he sees the throne of God, but it's a different from any perspective that any person's ever had to see. See, now, John is seeing God in heaven in a different way to what the prophets used to see heaven. So, prophets used to see heaven from the earth to heaven. But here John is looking at heaven from the perspective of heaven. That's why it's represented the church perspective, but not John. John was raptured up in heaven, and he saw the throne or had this vision of God in the heavens. But what's interesting is this: as he sees God, because he's in heaven, he's going to see how God is going to deal with man who's left upon this earth. And the reason there is this thunder and lightning coming out of it is because it represents the divine judgment and this wrath that's going to be poured out upon the world. Now let's look at verses 6, 7, and 8 of Revelation chapter 4. Verse 6 says this: And before the throne there was a sea of glass, like unto the crystal. And in the midst of the throne, around about the throne, were 4 beasts, full of eyes before and behind. Revelations 4 verse 7 says, and the first beast was like a lion, the second beast like a calf, third beast had a face as a man, and the fourth beast was like a flying eagle. Revelations 4 verse 8, and the 4 beasts had each of them 6 wings about them, and they were full of eyes within, and they rest not day and night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, which was and is to come. Now, I want you to underline the word beast. This is not the beast we're talking about in terms of the false prophet. We're not talking about the false Messiah or the false Jesus, that kind of thing. This is 4 beasts that they're translating here, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. People, let me just translate this. In John's days, a beast was a wild, untamed animal. And if you had a dog, that was a pet. You did not refer to that person as a beast. So which one is he talking about? If you went out and you had a cow or you had a horse, you didn't refer to him as a beast. Why? Because it was domesticated. It's not a wild or untamed animal. But a crocodile or an elephant or a rhinoceros are wild and untamed. So they were beasts because they were wild and they were untamed. Now, because these are not beasts, these are living creatures, you see the word beast is translated in the King James Version, is actually means zoon. And it refers to a living being or a living creature. How many of you heard the word Zoe? Okay, we've heard the word Zoe. Well, Zoe means life, in fact, which is actually used in the Greek, and we've heard the word Zoe because it comes from the word zoology. We've heard about zoology, the study of animals. The Zoe, which is pronounced Zoe, we get it from Zoe, which means life. So, well, this is the same thing. This is zoon, which means living beings, but normally they refer to it as living creatures. So John seeing 4 living creatures on each side of the throne. Now this is interesting because you have to do a little bit of numerology study. Because that's what really matters, you see. Because the 4 living creatures, each side of the throne, he doesn't know what to call them. He just knows that they're living beings. So when he says they're in the midst of the throne, he does not mean that they're sitting on the throne or they're within the throne somehow. What it means is they're in the middle of each side of the throne. In other words, it's almost like a square, because if you notice, he said that they're in the midst of the throne and they're around the throne. So what he's saying is on each side of the throne, if it is a square, which is probably was a square, it looks more like a square, and behind it you have one beast, and on the other side you have another, on the front you have another, and on the other side you have the other. So you can imagine a throne in the middle, and the picture is almost the 4 beasts are around the throne. It's quite symmetrical in its description. So the one that's on the side is in the middle of the side, and the one that's behind is in the middle of behind it. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Now, just like the 24 elders, there are a lot of speculations as to what these 4 living creatures are, but it's really not time just to figure that out at this moment in time. But the living creatures are angelic beings, and the reason we know that is because we studied the Bible at all in the Old Testament. You've seen that creatures like this described in the Old Testament. For example, in Isaiah's vision, in Ezekiel's vision, so we can just go back and look at some of those visions, and we'll see cherubims and seraphims, which are exactly the same as these angelic beings, as we see. And how many of you are familiar with that kind of thing? So those are the types, and I hope that kind of makes sense. Let's have a look at 1 or 2 of these. Let me just reconfirm this. Ezekiel chapter 10, verses 12 to 14. Let me just read that out to you. The cherubim had eyes over over their bodies, including their hands and their backs and their wings. Now, what do eyes represent? You see, in the New Testament, Jesus talked about the light of the eyes of the body, the light of the body as the eye. So what does the eye represent? Not just what we see, light, but not just what we see, but it's basically insight. So you got a good eye, you can see into people, and you can see the insights into people, what they actually mean. Not only are they at the throne of God, but they see what God desires and God wants, but they also see everything that is taking place. And there is nothing that's hidden from these four living creatures. That's going to be very interesting when we find out what they represent. To think that nothing is hidden from these animals. Now notice that each of these four cherubims had four faces. They had the face of an ox. It describes there the face of a human being. They had the face of a lion, and they had the face of an eagle. Now this is kind of interesting because if you ever saw Roman people in armor, you will see they will put a mask on, a face mask on, and the face mask would be exactly the same as the front as the back. And it was to confuse the enemy. And you can read that through some of the Greek myths like God of Janus and things like that. You know, actually, if you ever had any mutual findings, you would find that in most of the Roman gear that they used to wear. Well, what's interesting is that this creature that Ezekiel is describing is referred to as a cherubim, but he says the creature actually had four faces and never has to turn around. It has a face that looks forward, backwards, sideways, and so forth. The first one is the face of an ox. The second one is a human face. The third one is a lion face. And the fourth one is the face of an eagle. Now notice, as I've already stated, these cherubims have eyes all over them, and that's exactly what John describes in the book of Revelation. The faces of cherubim. Ezekiel's vision is very similar to what John describes, but there is a difference. The only difference that John's vision is this. In other words, the living beast that he described does not have four faces. Each beast only has one face. All right? A lion has his own face. The ox has his own face. The man has his own face. The eagle has his own face. So, we can see here, so the living creatures are very similar to the cherubims, but they are not the same. And that's very important, because they're also similar to the seraphims that described by Isaiah, in that they have 6 wings and they continually praising God. If you ever look up Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 to 3, you will see under King Uzziah, you see about this angel having 6 wings, fill the temple. You can read that for yourself. So, all right, seraphims and cherubims are totally different, but we need to understand this. So here's the mighty seraphim having these 6 wings. Right, so as we go into this, we will see a few things. We will see, in a sense, there is a combination of the 2 of the seraphims that Ezekiel talks about, and also what Isaiah talks about. We're talking about the best parts of the cherubim and the best parts of the seraphims, and they're combining them together now. So in Judaism, the number 4 is a number, numerically, would always point to what we call is the earth. In fact, I'm sure some of you have heard the expression, about the 4, the 4 parts of the earth, or the 4 corners of the earth. I'm going to the 4 corners of the earth. Well, that comes from Judaism. That comes from the Judaic background. And I'll tell you why. Because the earth is said to have 4 corners. How many of you ever heard someone say that before? But the Bible, in Isaiah chapter 11, verses 12, it says, He lifts up the standards of the nations, and He will assemble the banished ones of Israel, and He will gather the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. Now, what are the 4 corners of the earth? The 4 corners of the earth are the north, the south, the east, and the west. So in Judaism, in the Old Testament, number 4 is always symbolic of the earth. So if every time you come across 4, you will see it's symbolic of something to do with earth. So when you see 4 of anything in heaven, they have a job to do. There's a purpose. Job deals with the things upon the earth. Not only do they have a job that deals with the things upon the earth, but they're going to represent things on the earth as well. Now, before we actually look at the significance of these four, the lion, the ox, and so forth, we will find that there are some things that we will learn. The face of the man, the face of the eagle. And the reasons that there are four living creatures is they all on the side and around the throne is because one is like a lion, one is like an ox, one is like a man, one is like an eagle, and they are all around the throne. The lion is the king of the jungle. He's the king of all the wild beasts and therefore represents all the wild animals. And there's also the ox that is domesticated, representing the animals on this earth, a picture of strength. Then you have the man, who's the king of what the earth is. He's the man that represents the earth and those kind of things. And then you have the eagle that represents the air as well. And all these four creatures are around the throne. And they're doing one thing, and they are worshipping him. Now, Linsky, who is a very noted scholar, he was a Greek scholar, and he has had a great commentary on all the books of the New Testament. And he says this. He says the very same thing, but he says it slightly different. So he says, if you don't mind, he says this. He said the four creatures are, and he says, they are like lions that represent the wild places upon the earth. He says oxes represent the cultivated places on the earth. He says man represents the cities and the towns and the communities upon the earth. And he says eagles represent those who expanse of the air in the sky. So you have everything that's coming together to worship around the throne. The representation is just amazing. And that's very important because now we're going to look at their functions. Let's look at this quickly. And then we're almost coming to an end. What is the purpose of angelic beings? Does God just create these or not? Shouldn't say animals, does he just create the beings for the sake of them being there? No, when God creates something, it always has a purpose. You see, when we're judged to determine whether or not we're going to receive the reward or not, it's based upon the purpose. We're not all going to be judged the same way, but what is key here is that we're going to be judged based upon our gifts, our talents, and our abilities. God has called us all to do good works upon the earth, and if we don't do what we're called to do, we don't fulfill the purpose, we don't receive our reward. So when God created these four creatures, they have a purpose. What is the purpose? First of all, to lead worship in heaven. Not just worship in heaven, but they lead worship as a representative of all creation. When they start to worship, they're worshiping, or that I should say, they represent all the creation of worship. So chapter 4, verses 11, it says, when these beasts give glory and honor and thanks to him that sat on the throne, who liveth forever and ever, before the 20 elders fall down before him and sat on the throne, and they worshipped him, and they liveth forever and ever, and they cast their crowns before the throne, saying, thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power. Then this is interesting. Why? For thou hast created all things for their pleasure, and they were created. So you'll see also that these beasts leading worship in Revelation chapter 5, verses 8, 9, and 11, in chapter 19, and verses number 4. But they are strategically leading worship when it's all of creation, worshiping God because they represent all of God's created being, not in heaven, not in the heavens, on the earth. All right? So the direct outpouring of divine judgment upon this earth. When we begin God's judgment, this is back in the tribulation part. You know, we say a white horse, we see a red horse, we see a black horse, and we see a pale horse. And we get over here, and we truly see the wrath of God starting to happen. We see the seven vials, which we're going to look into, who's the one directing the outpouring. And you will see that these beasts are actually advocating, or they're the keys to unlocking these vials. They overlook the four different distinct parts of creation. And then we read in verses, in chapter 6, you know, we read these verses, as I watched the Lamb broke out the first of the seven seals on the scrolls, and I noticed they're going to to be 7 seals. And notice what happens each time a seal is broken. Each time a seal is broken, it says, "Come, I looked, saw a white horse standing there. Its riders carried a bowl, and the crown was placed on his head, and he rode out to win many battles and gain the victory." And I want you to know the first seal was open. The riders didn't come out until the beast, one of these 4, until the beast said, or living creature, one of the living creatures says, "Come." And God, divine judgment, comes out as the white horse comes out. And this goes on as we're going to be looked further more and more into the revelations that as the vials open, as God's wrath comes, right, these beasts has the key to allowing this to happen. Everybody's worshipping the throne at that time. And what is exciting is this. Jesus said this. When they said, these people to be quiet, they're worshipping you. He said, if they didn't praise me, he said, even the rocks would praise me. Because all of creation will praise God. All of creation, not just mankind, but all creation is waiting to be redeemed because man has subjected creation to fertility. And the word create and the word worship means one thing here. It means, in verses number 11, it means very simply this. It means worthy. In other words, we worship things that are much more worthy than we are, much more higher than we are. And it was Edward Henson, a scholar who I read about this. He was saying that the term worthy is the basis of English word meaning worship. So, we think our cars are more worthy. We think our houses are more worthy. We think everything else about us is more worthy. No, but Jesus says there are things I am more worthy. We worship sometimes athletes. We worship stars and football stars. We worship musicians. We worship all those kind of things. But Jesus says, I should be worshipped. I'm the one that should be worshipped. You should be worshiping me. And we will see further on as we get into chapter 4 and 5 next time when I come back as well. Because God is just going to unravel his wrath. And we're going to see these items unravel, these bowls. We're going to see all these vials starting to open up as well as God pours out his Spirit and his wrath on this earth during the tribulation. But the greatest thing is about this, now the church is in heaven, but there is the tribulation time to come. Amen.